So for those of you who are here, are you able to see the screen? Great. We will get started in just a minute to a minute and a half. I did post this video, not this video, this PowerPoint presentation as a resource for this talk. You can see it, the third button down next in the chat under resources, and you can even download it right there if you like. That does give you a little bit of freedom to be able to explore the presentation while we're doing it. If I'm saying something particularly boring, and we're going to be doing a few hands-on activities, actually one hands-on activity, and then I'm going to ask you a handful of questions. So make sure that you have your keyboard ready. I hate to make you do homework, but this is a tricky topic, even for those people who think that you have an understanding of it. It takes a long time in order to be able to master. So just 30 seconds and then we'll get going. There's supposed to be a way that I can tell how many people are here. Sometimes I can tell and sometimes I can't. Okay, let's get the show on the road. So this topic of open licensing is exceedingly important in the open community because the actual word open comes from the use of open licensing. For many of you, you've been exposed to open licensing at one point or another in your life or multiple times in your life, but it's important in order to be able to master. I talked about this a few days ago when I was introducing the license restacker. I will bring that back up again at the end of this presentation, and the discussion that I gave. If it didn't make sense a couple days ago, hopefully after we go through this overall introduction of things, it'll start to make a little bit more sense in terms of why we do what we do. I will be monitoring uh, the uh, the chat, so feel free to comment if there are any issues, and I can go forward with that. So let's get this thing going. So let's start with actually defining OER, which makes things a bit easier for us. There are two general definitions that one can use for OER. Justin mentioned this before, but he didn't actually give you the definition, so I actually want to write it down here. So one is the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. This foundation has been quite critical in advancing OER and open in general in America for a variety of reasons. They've been underlying a lot of projects, OpenStacks and other things like that. Unfortunately, LibreTexts has never gotten any support from them, but nonetheless, their impact is certainly not negligible. This is the definition that they have used for a while. And that is open educational resources, or OER, are free and openly licensed educational materials that can be used for teaching, learning, research, and other purposes. So the key point that we have here is the emphasis on openly licensed. So it's defined from a legal perspective of licensing, which is one of the reasons why Creative Commons is so important here. The educational materials basically makes it open education resource instead of just an open resource. And teaching, learning, research, and other purposes are secondary in terms of these definitions. I do want to emphasize also that while I didn't bold the word free here, uh, the general interpretation associated with this is that that OER doesn't have to be free. It is oftentimes associated with being free. The motivation that we have for being for doing it is free, but you can certainly charge for OER. Um, uh, the other definition came around 5, 6, 7 years ago from the uh, UNESCO definition. And it is very similar to this. Open educational resources are teaching, learning, or research materials that are in the public domain or released with intellectual property licenses that facilitate the free use, adaptation, and distribution of resources. So in this case here, they introduced the concept that public domain could be an appropriate, it's not technically a license, but designation for material. Um, and they put a little bit more emphasis on free use, and this caused a little bit of controversy in the community, again at the end of the last decade, because a lot of people wanted to separate out again free from um, uh, or cost from open, which I again discussed in the past. So um, uh, so let's talk about open licenses, for example. Here we have now. I know it's a little, uh, it comes with the nature of the beast when you're talking about licenses to have a lot of text in order to be able to do these things, to be specific. And that's one of the reasons why I shared this presentation in the beginning of my presentation, for you to be able to review it and skip over the things that are a little dry, like I'm trying to do here. So, or not trying to do, but I have to deal with. So both of those definitions involve open licensing. So what is open licensing? So open licenses are allows content to be free, as in the freedom of speech, freedom of how you want to use it. It's basically liberty, a definition of freedom, not cost, a definition of freedom. And the English language has only one word for that, but if we were in other languages like the Romance languages, they have liberté and gratis in order to be able to address that, coming from Latin. But anyways, they're not necessarily free from costs. Examples: one of the first set of open licenses were the new open licenses, or now the free document licenses. Those came out of the infrastructure for coding and programming, and the need in order to be able to protect the licensing of the underlying code of things. Creative Commons came about not long afterwards as an infrastructure in order to facilitate that. Public domain is not technically a license. And there are a handful of other people that use other types of open licenses that they would generally call open left licenses instead of, or copyleft instead of copyright licenses that are out there. The issue is that the greater corpus of OER has a wide range of licensing on there, and that causes a wide range of confusion or complexity, as many of you mentioned a couple days ago. I will mention, for example, Wikipedia for the in the first 5 to 7 years of its existence was using the new public licensing for its content, and then around, I think, 2010 2011 or so, switched over to Creative Commons licensing and such. And I don't want to go into the finer details between both of those licensing infrastructures, but the Creative Commons licensing is a little bit better suited for non-programming based infrastructures. And there are other licensing approaches out there, or systems that are especially important for compiled code, like MIT licensing, BSD licensing, and other things like that, which I'm basically going to be ignoring for this perspective. So the idea behind licensing is, when you create content, it is intrinsically licensed, at least in America. I mean, at the point of creation of a new resource that involves creativity, in order to be able to put this together, that you have a protection and ownership of that, or what's typically referred to as intellectual property ownership, or IP. Which is a term that many of us hear on television all the time, because IP, that is where you can make a lot of money if you want to be able to create something and then let other people use what you've created. The key point is that you are allowing other people to use what you've created. You are not relinquishing your rights, ownership rights, to that material. And that licensing, that permission that you give there, is complicated, because there's a range of different permissions that you, as an intellectual property owner, can provide to other people. Uh, uh, and that we'll be going over in a moment. Creative Commons licensing formalizes it into a very specific, simplified structure in order to work off of, but there's a lot more opportunities in place if you want to be able to deviate from Creative Commons licensing if you find that to be restricting that's out there. So the key point is that if you are remixing, which is the term that's generally used in the open community of reusing other people's content, it's the open licenses that essentially establishes your ability in order to be able to do that. Such that you have legal protections that you're not infringing on the intellectual property rights of the people who've actually created it. Uh, and that's exceedingly important. So many of us, if not most of us, have experienced situations where people, students, colleagues have actually copied and pasted content from the internet that they just found on a page and they used it with something else. That right there, in general, unless it's very clear that there's a license that allows you to be able to do that, is not licensable. And about 99.9% of the content on the internet is not designed, does not give you the license to be able to copy and paste accordingly. This is one of the issues that is actually underlying, for example, the AI efforts where they've scraped the internet, brought it into a database, and many people consider that to be theft because it's violating the copyrights of the intellectual property owners for that. That's a different topic, but I just want to be able to dovetail into something that you may have some familiarity with. Okay, so I mentioned this multiple times. I'll reiterate this. OER does not equal free, at least the current definition in the United States. Free can be used to designate two things in the English language: liberty and cost. Like I said, you go into other languages, they have very clear distinctions between these two. Open is the opposite of closed, which is the general argument of where liberty is. So, liberty, free in the terms of liberty, it gives you permissions to do things, not necessarily having it free. The question is just how free is it, which in the sense of liberty, what resources do you have what permissions do you have the ability to do with that content? What does that intellectual property owner allow us to do? Um, and then you invariably want to discuss the possibility of cost because it's connected intimately with the way that we operate. That was half of what I discussed yesterday when I was talking about issues associated with for-profit and not-for-profit companies and how that dictates how organizations operate. So you can ask the same question about if it's free, just how free is it cost-wise? And that's more than just basically saying how much does it cost. That is also how you can access it, how long you can host it, and you have to repay for it, and other things like that, which are all big issues in academia. Okay, so many of you have heard about the 5 Rs. So this is a sort of a way of codifying the core principles or the core permissioning that we will use in order to define OER. And this was codified by David Wiley about 15 to 20 years ago. And while many people debate about different aspects of what constitutes OER, this right here I'd call the Constitution, the hardcore Constitution that has no amendments to my knowledge, although people are starting to have lots of tweaks to it that they like to emphasize. So let's talk about the 5 Rs. Um, there we go. So it's retain. Actually, this okay. It's retain, it's reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute. So these are the 5 permissions. If you don't have the ability in order to buy the license to do all 5 of these things, I personally and most people in the community say that this is not OER. It may give you permissions to do certain things, but it's not within the scope of OER, or it's not sufficiently open for us to be able to do these things. So retain is the permissions in order to hold the content on your own database, in your own computer, in your own system. You can do it in a wide range of different formats off of there, but the ability to retain it is important. Reuse, the ability in order to take it and then being able to own the copies that you have. Revise is the ability not just to host it, but to actually be able to cut into it and start to adapt it and customize it to your own purposes. If you remember what I was talking about yesterday when I was talking about the principal reasons why we actually pursued the construction of the ChemWiki that then evolved into LibreTexts, it was control. And I feel this is one of the more important aspects that open provides us, not just the financial aspects, because as I mentioned before, technically the financial aspects are not connected to open in this definition. Remix. So remix is the ability in order to take content and reconstruct it in order to be able to build a new product. I'm going to go back to refining the topic of remix in a little bit more detail a little bit later on because people can interpret it in a variety of different ways. I think it actually is a very ambiguous topic when you actually start viewing it from a more detailed perspective of legality. But nonetheless, the idea is someone creates it, you can create it, you can actually start to modify it. And lastly, the ability in order to distribute it or redistribute it in order to make sure you have all R's off of here. So you can take it and you can share it. If you don't have all five of these permissions, it is not OER, period. Off of there. And then there are again lots of other people who put additional R's on here in order to talk about how they want to define OER. I don't typically get into discussions associated with those things because this right here is the core that constitutes OER. So the idea behind OER or open in general is that it's a paradigm shift for how we operate. And it's that paradigm shift that a lot of people are resistant in order to be able to adopt. And they resist in a variety of ways. So obviously, commercial publishers are resistant to the idea of other people holding content and distributing it because they want to monetize it. But many faculty haven't gone through the paradigm shift of being able to understand the concept that it's not necessarily that you don't own the material, it's that you've created material and it's the community that's then able to grow from the material and move forward with it. Now, the other thing that's actually particularly important here is that when you create material and you put a license on the material that you give permissions to use it, unless that license says very clearly that only one person's allowed to use it, but another person's not allowed to use it. For example, if I create something that said, here is a textbook, but only people in Davis, California are allowed to use it. And if you're outside of Davis, California, you're not allowed to use it. That's a really funky geo-locked like license. And there are people who do geo-lock licenses in their way, the very unwieldy approaches. You're essentially saying that once it's distributed, you don't have the rights in order to be able to implement more protections on what's done, assuming you can't revoke the license off of there, which is a little bit more complicated issue that Creative Commons addresses. So this is the paradigm shift that people that I experienced last decade a lot. That people created a book and then they said, "Okay, this is my book. I want to host it on this platform." And they put a license that allows it to be distributed, the 5 Rs that's there. And then we say, okay, well, that's fine. But then we want to put it on this other platform and distribute it in a different ways. And they come in and they say, well, I don't like that. And I said, well, you cannot like that, but the license that you gave there was for the community in order to take it and move with it. And it's that uncomfortability that is one of the reasons why many academics are not like jumping hardcore into here because it's conflicting with the general protections that we are used to having with what we've created. So obviously publishers are particularly concerned about this because this breaks down their conventional business model, which is print a book, sell the book. Uh, you own the book, but you're unable to photocopy the book unless you keep it. You're unable to distribute it either to your students or anybody else. Now they've switched over into a more subscription model, so you have access to the book for only a certain period of time, and they pull it back, and et cetera, et cetera. You can go over lots of different ways that publishers actually started modifying these things. But publishers in general are resistant to OER because of the paradigm shift that it actually has on their industry. Uh, and that extends not just to publishing, but to a wide range of business models out there, because most business models are focusing around making something and limiting access to that something, except for being able to pay for it. So many models have to be tweaked in order to be able to operate within OER. Uh, and this again dovetails with the aspects I talked about before in terms of for profit and not for profit companies and how you handle sustainability and other things like that. So, okay. So let's talk about some of the licensing systems that we have available. So public domain is not technically a license system; it's the lack of a license. So when something is uh, in the public domain, and this date right here is not correct. This is an older slide. It should be updated another 4 years, 4 or 5 years later. When something is put into the public domain, it's basically meant for anybody and everybody to be able to use it however they want. No permissions available or necessary in order to be able to do. And the intent off of that is, as a community, we will provide protections to the creators of content for as long as they're living. There's a certain period of time in America, I think it's 20 years after their death. Uh, and that protection is meant in order to be able to provide incentives for the creation of creative material. And that's great. And then at some point, it's considered in the best interest of the community in order to have unfettered access to what was created. Uh, and that is public domain. Now, anybody who has intellectual property rights on a specific material can put a public domain designation on their site, basically saying they are dedicating what they've done to the community and they have no limitations at all. And there are many people who do that sort of thing. In the open community, it's actually much smaller than what I would like, but most of it is formulated within the other parts of the other systems like Creative Commons and licensing. One example that I come up with all the time is Mohammed Malik, who's actually here, who created thousands and thousands of chemistry questions in Adapt, and he puts public domain on all of them. And that's a philosophy that he has, and it's a great philosophy in order to be able to pursue. Uh, but lots of material we have don't have quite the same unfettered access for there. So I mentioned the new public licenses before here. I typically forget how to pronounce this and call it GNU at times, but nonetheless, that has evolved over the years. And this is the same. This is the licenses that they currently have: the GPL3, the LGBTL, and the AGBTL. Like I said, this is an infrastructure that's largely used within. Um, Coding scenarios of programming, but it can be used for OER, and there are many people who use this for OER. So when you go into our library and you select a license for a page or for a book, you have access to this license. Uh, and here's a link that you can use if you want to be able to look at these licenses in more detail. But the who rules the roost in OER licensing for the last 15 plus years is the Creative Commons infrastructure. And Creative Commons licensing you can access via this URL right here. And it involves 9 licenses that have different levels of permissioning in order to be able to add onto the resource to enable some or all of the 5 R's. So I mentioned that not all licenses are completely compliant with the definition of OER that I described before. So um, I just want to make sure I'm not getting any comments off of here. Are you guys all cool with me? Am I going too fast, too slow? Is this aligned with your guys' interests? Uh, I got a bunch of thumbs. So great. I'll get this thing going here. Um, so what is open? Open is the opposite of closed. So basically, closed in the sense of not having permissions to being able to do things. So you can view this off of here. Open is free, but just how free and the cost is. So these are the questions that I posed before off of here. And this is an image that's oftentimes given in order to show the Creative Commons licensing and the range of permission that you have, or it's basically the range of openness that you have. And these are not all Creative Commons licensing. For example, at the top here is a public domain. Creative Commons has a designation calling it CC0, which is their term of folding it into their infrastructure, which is largely public domain, meaning that there's no limitations at all in terms of what you're able to do. That right there is at the top, which is the freest of the free. Uh, Again, using the example that Muhammad Malik used for his chemistry problems. At the other end are all rights reserved. All rights reserved means you have no permissions at all, period. The permissions that you have are dictated by individual interactions. For example, you give money in order to be able to own a book. But you don't actually own the copyright of the book, just the actual physical copy of the book. Um, and such. And between these two ranges, from completely open to completely closed, within the Creative Commons licensing, has a range of permissions that are out there. So each of these circles, well, the Creative Commons circle indicates it's Creative Commons, but each of these circles after that designates a specific permission that that license allows other people to use. Let me phrase that. It's not necessarily a permission, it's a restriction on the permission that you're allowed to use that. So, for example, up here in the green, which is the most open, is the public domain license, or the CC0 license. Like I said, no restrictions at all. The next one is CC BY. BY in this case here means you have a byline. You have attribution requirements. And I'm not going to be discussing the specifics of attribution requirements because that's a different topic. But the key point here is saying that if you want to use this material, you subject to the 5 R's, which you can do, you have to provide attribution of who it was that created it. And that right there aligns strongly with academic interests and just generally a community interest across the board. It is found in all the other licenses, typically by that's connected to it. And that's why we have at the bottom of our pages very automatic attributions. You go to adapt and we have attributions buttons right there. We put attributions everywhere because we're OER first and it's necessary to provide attributions. What happens if I use it and I don't provide an attribution? Well, I'm not compliant with the license. And if I'm not compliant with the license, the intellectual property user, sorry, intellectual property owner, has the rights to come back and revoke my use of that content. And just in case you're wondering, has that happened? It has happened to us uh, uh, for a variety of for several reasons, but actually one reason that came up there, and that has to do with the introduction of a new license that was came in because they didn't like the old license and such like that. So Robbie had a question. Let me finish just this train of thought, and then I'll jump back to your question. Then we have the ability of CC BY share alike. Now, share alike is a little odd. Share alike is basically saying you have the inability to change the license of the material. Now, that's kind of weird because you're not actually ever changing the license of the material because that's dictated by the intellectual property owner. What you're doing is you're dictating the ability of relicensing an adaptation on that material. So basically that you took the material and you revamped it, and then you can then change the license on here. The key point is that this locks you down to only using this license. This right here, for those of you that got the restacker discussion a couple days ago, will understand that it folds into the restacker and how it actually works off of there. So before I go into the other things, there are a few questions that are in the chat. Let me just grab to that. So Robbie mentioned a bit off topic, but what do you know the current stances in controlled digital lending? That is off the track appreciably. Let's talk about that a little bit later on. Part of that is predicated on what's called fair use, and fair use is outside of licensing. It's basically the ability to use content within a limited scope of things, or empowered by the government in order to be able to do things. For example, libraries are allowed to host content outside of licensing in certain ways because they are harbors of knowledge. But that right there is a completely different topic. Let's postpone that to a different time, or if we have discussion, if we have points afterwards. Okay. Dania asks, what does zero icon mean in the upper right hand? CC0 means no license. It's basically public domain. It's public domain within the infrastructure that you have. Um, okay. So, anyways, the next one has CC BY, and then it has this dollar sign, which is obviously very dollar oriented, which is America, North America based approach on these things, and it means non-commercial. Uh, I'm going to ask. I'll talk about what non-commercial means in a moment, because most people would think that that means that you have no commercial activity. That's technically correct. The question is, what exactly is a commercial activity? Um, then there's an example of adding buy, NC, and share alike. So you can basically lock down the license in this case. And at the very end here, the most restrictive are CC BY, and then they have this equal signs, which represents no derivatives. That means that you have the content and you're unable to edit the content to make what's called an adaptation or derivative. So let me ask you this. Do you believe that a non-derivative claused uh, content with non-derivative clause on it is OER? And as a reminder, it needs to satisfy these five criteria, these five parts of the Constitution. Okay. Several of you said no. For those of you that said no, why? A lot of you said no. Doesn't allow revision or remixing. Key point, you can't make it adaptation. So while you can find content out there that have the CC by ND or CC by NC ND out there, within the formal definition here, you can't modify it in order to be able to do things. Now, I will be a little bit more nuanced here. There are opportunities to use it in certain ways, but it's probably one of the most onerous entries that we have in the infrastructure today. We have a lot of stuff that's ND. I tend to stay away from it if I can. The Open Textbook Library used to host, and not host, but they used to provide links, is largely referatory, but found the links to content that had ND license off of it. And in 2019, I believe, or 2020, they came out and they said no more ND. It's not open within OER, and they don't want to be able to accept it. There are many reasons that you would want to have ND out there. The big reason that people push out there is associated with, for example, discussions or points that are uh, internalized or personable. Many people like to connect it to Aboriginal rights. So things that you want to provide a protection that you can't take and start to modify it, because it's the voice of someone that's out there. And that's the only real community, only real thing that I hear people push about why you should be doing ND that's out there. But you can find many of these things all over the place. And keep in mind that every page on the LibreText has a license. You can look at the bottom of the LibreText in order to see the license, or an icon at the top in order to be able to indicate it, whether it's Creative Commons or new or public domain or other things that are out there. So that is a long overview to Creative Commons licensing. Just again, as to summarize here, these are the general restrictions. If you want to use it and it has by, which is anything other than CC0, you need to display a set of components necessary in order to be able to address that. We have share alike, which means you can't change the license, non-commercial, which means you can't participate in commercial activities, and no derivatives means that you can't make an adaptation or a derivative associated with that content, which means you can't modify that content and such. We went through lots of effort to make it so that we could facilitate using these things effectively on our platform. That's what the restacker is designed for. That's what the auto tracker is designed for. That's why we have page level attributions, book level attributions, content level attributions, in order to be able to really push us. We take this very seriously, and you should be taking this very seriously, because this is the law that's associated with it. Going back to what I said before, if you don't follow these rules and you use someone else's intellectual property, they can then revoke your rights to do so. Uh, they also are in a position to insist on money. For example, there are individuals out there that paste an image on Wikipedia, and then they have a clause off of there that you have to provide a very specific attribution that has a link to their name. Many people will then use that image, but they don't pay attention to that attribution requirement. Uh, then they go after you if they find it, and then they'll say, you've infringed on the intellectual property rights. You have to pay them $600. Uh, and I know this because this happened 6 months ago to us. Uh, and we had to go back and argue with them and finally got them to run away. But this is a more predatory approach in order to be able to address these things. Uh, and so it's important in order to take care of these things, especially as people, organizations like OpenStax, that have started to take their more open resources like CC BY and start to convert it into CC BY share alike non-commercial because they want to have, I think they want to have more control over the finances associated with that, but it makes things less open, and such. Okay, so this is uh, this showcases these permissions of the Creative Commons licensing, along with these general arguments. You can copy and publish. You have to provide attribution because you have buy here. You have commercial use, which is basically anything other than CC BY. I'm sorry about that slide right there. Um, you have the ability to adapt, which is anything other than the ND. Uh, and then you have the ability to license change, which is a fifth thing on here, which is important in order to do this. That's the inability of the share alike access off of here. So different people choose different licenses because they have different priorities. And that's perfectly fine. And when you want to be able to, if you want to create resources and identify the license on here, which is invariably the first question that people have when they do these things, is like, what license does it mean? You can go to the creativecommons.org chooser, and it will actually step through and ask you questions associated with what those priorities, and it will help you identify the license that you may want to do. And I encourage you to be able to check that. I unfortunately can't. I didn't paste this into the chat, but I will do so. Uh, right here. And again, I encourage you to take a look at that again. Letitia asked, could you share the link to the presentation? It's in the resource section of the page, right next to the chat, the third icon from the bottom. Um, uh, Elizabeth asks, is predatory practice becoming common? I presume she's asking about faculty, people who've actually put images on Wikipedia and other sources. Flickr was really quite popular in that they then use it as a mechanism in order to extort people who use it with improper attributions. It was more popular about 5 years ago. It's gotten reduced in various ways. One part is because uh, people can hear me, right? Okay. Uh, so, uh, sorry, Chris, I'm not sure what the issue you have there. So, um, uh, Flickr switched the version numbering for their Creative Commons licensing, at least for default, to 4.0, which has better protections than the earlier versions that they have. I'm not going to talk about version numbering because that adds another level of complexity behind here. But I do encourage people to take a look at this chooser so you can get uh, some things off here. So let me talk about commercial rights. So the idea behind commercial in licensing means that it's not primarily intended or directed toward commercial advantage. What that really means is it's not for profit. So let me phrase that. That commercial activity is meant for profit. Uh, you can do activity that involves the transfer of money, which many of us would consider to be commercial, that is only meant to handle costs. That right there is compliant with the non-commercial clause of these resources. So, for example, any book that's on our platform, you can get a physical copy of. We do that even though we have a lot of non-commercial clause content on the LibreText because we charge only the costs associated with printing and then a small cost for handling, hosting, and distribution. We operate at cost. We are not making a profit. If we made 1 penny profit off of that, we would be in violation of the non-commercial clause. And actually, we operate in the red off of that just to make everything fine. So that's an example of using non-commercial clause material, but still having some revenue distribution that most average people would consider to be commercial. Um, okay. Okay. Personally, I would prefer it not to be called non-commercial. I would prefer it to be called nonprofit. But that's the case. So I just want to re-emphasize what commercial actually means. So what about derivative? That ND component that's connected to it. Well, this gets more complicated, but this is important because it changes a little bit about how LibreTexts operates with our licensing. So a derivative work, sometimes called an adaptation, uh, is an expressive creation based on one or more existing works. It involves modifying, translating, remixing, or transforming the original content into a new original work. Uh, you notice that this is not using the term remixing. This is derivative. This is the formalism that's used in licensing. And this is the general definition associated with either derivative or adaptation. So you got to take something and make it creative. So this is a lot of text. All I care about is the first sentence here, which is a derivative work is one in which is not based on previous work, but also contains sufficiently new creative content to entitle it to its own copyright. That's the key point. So let me ask a few questions about this. Okay, when is a remix, which is the term I used of using other materials into a book, not derivative? Um, it may not be derivative if you haven't modified it. So if I took an entire OpenStax book uh, and I copy it and put my name on it, the community would call it a remix. It's not a derivative because there's nothing original put into it. It's not an adaptation. Adriana asked, "How is sufficiently new and modified quantified?" That's a great question. It is a legal question, and it's debated in a judge in order to be able to make the argument about whether it is the case or not. And there are numerous examples of that. For example, uh, for those of you that remember the 2008 presidential election where Obama won, there was an image, a poster that had him looking up with the word hope on it that was in red and black. Uh, it turned out that that right there was an adaptation of an existing picture. Uh, and the person who took the picture had intellectual property rights for it. And he went to court claiming it was not sufficiently original to justify it as an adaptation. But because it wasn't even openly licensed, it didn't have that protection off of there. Is even worse, it didn't have permissioning, and because it wasn't modified significantly, uh, 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 it was basically he was forced to pay royalties on it. Uh, so this right here is a legal definition, and as with all legal definitions, it's really a not a given, not 100% this or 100% that. It's always a percentage and an issue of risk and trying to identify those things. That's why many people put the clause, I am not an attorney. Do not assume I'm giving legal advice here. I should have mentioned that in the very beginning. I am not an attorney. So don't, I'm not trying to give legal advice here. Okay. Uh, so, um, So if you place an unmodified work along with other works, for example, in ethnology, you've generated a collection, not a derivative. And this is really quite important because LibreText really pushes this, but it's complicated. You can take content and put them together, and if you don't modify it, it becomes a collection technically. Uh, and if they're inconsistent in their licensing, which I'll be going to in a moment, you can still put a collection on it and still use it, which many people in the community don't fully comprehend. So you basically say that it doesn't have a single license, to describe the work. It is a collection. You need to look at the licensing at the individual level or the paragraph level or block level that's associated with that. And that's one of the licensing options you have available called mixed or mixed slash collective. Um, so I will also mention at the end, if the changes are too minor to be copyrightable, then it's not an adaptation. That gets exactly into Adriana's question. And that, again, is debatable. Correcting typos, changing the formats. The ND clause in Creative Commons allows you to change formats. That is a permission that you have. So any ND related content that someone has created somewhere else, we can bring into our platform. As long as we don't modify it, it's in a new format and it's still allowed. Okay, now let's get into the complexities that actually cause people grief. When we make an adaptation, we have the ability in order to add a license onto the resource, the new resource. The content that we're adapting does not lose its copyright. It's still there with the same license that was added to it. We are just modifying it by putting another license on top of it in order to be able to do. And that is a compliance issue because you can't choose any license you want to put on top of the license of the material that you're using. And you have a limitation, and this is the Creative Commons licensing compatibility chart. This you'll see all the time. I'm not overly fond of the way this chart is put together because it doesn't emphasize which license you should select. But it does tell you what licenses can kind of coexist. So for example, if you have public domain, you have no requirements on it. You can actually mix public domain with any license except this one. I'm going to leave the ND stuff around. I have some issues with some of these definitions here, but nonetheless, when you start dealing with collections, you can start to deviate from here. But this is adaptation off of here. So um, this one here tells you what you're allowed to mix or add together. So the pluses are the checks are good, the X's are bad. So when you remix, this is invariably an issue that comes into here. So this is a logic table. This is the logic table that's added to the restacker in order to test these things out automatically for you, because this is a pain in order to be able to master. This right here is a better description for it, and I apologize, I couldn't find a high resolution image of this thing that describes it in a little bit better detail, saying here is the license of the original work, and here's the license that you add on top of the work. So it's not bidirectional, and it describes the utility of what you're able to mix in different ways. And this is what I want to be able to have you guys do. Actually, we're going to use the other chart. I want you just to understand that there's this directional perspective associated with it. But I want to transition into the project, normally I'd say work as a team or think pair share thing, but we don't have that infrastructure here, so we're going to do this individually. I'm going to give you a set of links. And I want you to pick any two random links here. I'll paste them into the chat and ask the question, can you combine them together into a single resource, and what would be the license of that resource? And I will paste this on here as a mechanism for being able to do that. So like I said, I'm going to copy this, paste this into the chat. We're going to spend 5 to 7 minutes on here. Looks like there's a limitation in terms of what I'm allowed to paste number wise, amount wise. So I will paste more in here. Okay, so in those 3 entries I put into the chat are 5 to 7 to 8 different entries. Look at each of them, and your job is, number 1, identify the license. So you can't figure out how to remix something if you can't identify the license. And I can tell you sometimes you can't identify the license of material. 2, do that for any pair, identify each license, and then look at the table that is on the screen here and ask the question, actually, this is not the right table. This one here asks the question, is it compliant? So does it have a check mark associated with that? And then I'd like you to think about which one of these things license do you think would be the right license for the new material that combines those two things together. Now, that's actually the other license on here, but I actually want to stick it with this one here and we can have the discussion here. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to go about doing these things, and then we'll come back and I'm going to ask you to tell me your results that are on here. And I'll leave this compatibility chart up here for you to be able to review it as you actually go through these things. And I strongly encourage you actually to do this activity because it's uh, you learn by doing, and this right here is something that we do all the time in LibreText. So I'm seeing a bit of discussions going on here. Many people identified that many of the selections that they did were not compatible, uh, and that is perfectly fine. Many things are not compatible. And Elizabeth uh, Ball got the consequence of things that even though they're not compatible, uh, I want to emphasize this because the community goes in a slightly different way than the way we view these things. So the 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 way the Creative Commons basically says is these things are not compatible. You can't mix them. Stop. You can't put a license on the whole resource. You can't combine them. Period. Uh, and that's restricting. But that's not actually what you can do. Like I said, is if they're not compatible, you don't have a license that works with both materials, you can come in and make that license that's associated as a collection. It's not technically a license, and basically it says that each material is used individually. Uh, and it still retains its licensing because it always does, but you just can't relicense it under a single license. Is that a problem? No, it's not. You can still do that stuff, but it does mean that you don't have a single license for your book. So I'd love to be able to keep on talking about that, but let's move on. I want to discuss that in a slightly different context, which is uh, a licensing stack. Um, so a licensing stack uh, is a term used in the licensing community. It's not formally defined in law, but it's basically the practice of combining multiple software, data, hardware licenses, basically multiple licenses within a package. Each one has its characteristic license off of there. Uh, and in using that resource, you have to be compliant with all the licensing that's there. That's actually part of the compliance issue that you have with the Creative Commons licensing that's in place there. The way I like to view it is to try to say, you who have this resource, you have a license on top. Are you compliant with the licensing that's in your resource? Basically, the content that's used off of the thing. Yeah. So that's the reason why we like to show when you go to a book in the Commons, you'll see a breakdown. So say these are the licenses of your book, which is a lot more transparent than just basically here's a single license. Uh, and I think not just more transparent, more accurate out there. So you have one image in your entire book that has the non-commercial clause on it, and everything else can be perfect, have no non-commercial clause. That whole book cannot be used in a commercial way, period. And that is not just text, that's an image. There are lots of people who misunderstand image licensing in the mixture of things. They just view things as a text. And we're going to start to have a more expanded approach in order to deal with that. But the way that we're dealing with this is what I mentioned before, which is our restacker. So this is a restacker report from a book. I'm not entirely sure which book it was. I just grabbed it an hour ago. And it shows the book license that they put down as CC BY NC Share Alike 4.0. That has to be compliant with the page licenses. And if you took these two here and you went to that compliance score, you'll see that these two are compliant. So that means that this is allowed in order to do it from the book to the page license. But you also have to deal with the page license to the content license, the content that's actually used there, the one that the intellectual property owner put onto it. So this page right here, 1.1, its content is CC by, the page is CC by NC, and the book is CC by NC share alike 4.0. This one here doesn't have a number on it, so it's not even properly put down. So when we do a click on here, we'll identify all the compliances necessary in order to be able to do these things. This one here is not necessary; it just has to have two. And if it is out of compliance, it will then give you a recommendation on how to be in compliance. And if it's not in compliance, it will then say you have to switch to a collection. That's perfectly fine in order for you to be able to do. Just treat it like a collection properly. And most of the platforms out there do a very poor job of understanding collections. So hopefully after this whole discussion and the exercises that you went to, you understand at least better why the restacker is really a cool technology. Really a cool tool in order to be able to facilitate when you remix a book on our platform in order to ensure that you're compliant with all the licensing. You don't have legal issues associated with what you're doing here, and it's just a transparent, open way in order to be able to deal with other people's content instead of folding attributions or things in various hidden spots and different parts of the book. This is really out there, right there, and ready to go. Do I believe this is the right way to do things? Yes. I strongly believe this is the right way to do things. And I hope that the greater community starts to actually adopt something similar in order to be able to affect this. This is open source technology. It's available for other people to pick up if they actually want to fold it into their platform. But you need to have auto attribution capabilities in place to track the content. And that's what Pressbooks or other platforms don't have. So they'd have to restructure things. So I will end with what I always end, which is the future is open. We're very excited with being able to handle licensing in a better way. Hopefully you guys have a better understanding of open licensing and how to be able to manipulate that and understand some of the complexities associated with the people who have to teach other faculty about how to handle open licensing. And there are lots of things I haven't discussed. I haven't discussed version numbers. I haven't discussed mixing licensing between two different systems. Uh, 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 well, those are the two immediate ones that I didn't discuss that's out there. So there's a lot more involved in that. If you want to get better educated in that, Creative Commons provides their own training session associated with that. We're also going to be providing our own version of that training session in our academy infrastructure, both as an asynchronous course and also as an in-person course, because we developed our infrastructure through trial and error, through fire, through lots of litigation. And we talked to Creative Commons general counsel multiple times on various things that we've done in order to be able to do these things. So we went through the pain so you don't have to, and we're happy in order to be able to share with that.